ونستغفره ونعوذ بالله من شرور أنفسنا ومن سيئات أعمالنا من يهده الله فلا مضل له ومن يضلل فلا هادي له وأشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله صلى الله عليه وعلى آله وأصحابه ومن تبعهم بإحسان إلى يوم الدين أما بعد. So as we continue discussing the book Bulugh Al-Maram by Al-Hafiz Ibn Hajar Al-Asqalani rahimahullah ta'ala, and we are discussing Kitab At-Tayammum, so the book that discusses matters regarding Tayammum, the ahkam of Tayammum. So in today's lesson we discuss another of those hadith relating to this topic. We'll be covering inshallah ta'ala the hadith of Ibn Umar, and so the hadith will be read and then we'll go through discussing the ahkam that relates to this particular hadith of Ibn Umar. Tafaddal.
Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wa sallallahu wa sallam ala nabiyyina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam. Chapter 9, Tayammum. Hadith 111, narrated Ibn Umar radiyallahu anhuma. Allah's Messenger sallallahu alayhi wa sallam said, Tayammum, purifying with the soil, consists of two strikings of the soil, one for the face and one for the hands up to the elbows. Reported by Ad-Daraqutni, and the Imams graded it as Sahih, and the Imams graded it Sahih as Mawquf, a saying of a companion.
So this is the hadith that is mentioned here by Ibn Hajar in this discussion regarding Ahkam At-Tayammum, where in the previous hadith we discussed the hadith of Ammar ibn Yasir that give us some insight regarding as to how one to perform a tayammum. So how, the way in which to perform a tayammum. So the first hadith of Ammar ibn Yasir, it mentioned that for striking it is once. Now this hadith of Ibn Umar radiyallahu anhuma, it mentions something which is different. So as for the hadith that is mentioned here, قال المؤلف رحمه الله تعالى عن ابن عمر رضي الله عنهما قال رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم التيمم ضربان. The tayammum ضربتان، ضربة للوجه وضربة لليدين إلى مرفقين. Then I also mention رواه الدارقطني وصححه الأئمة ووقفه. So this is the hadith that is mentioned here as this discussion, within the discussion of how to perform a tayammum. So first that we'll discuss, we have mentioned before regarding Ibn Umar, Abdullah ibn Umar, we have mentioned something about him previously. So we'll mention the next matter, which is takhrij of the hadith. So the next step is takhrij of the hadith, which is going over to see, referencing back the hadith, and also the aqwal of the ulama pertaining to the ruling on this particular hadith. So as for the hata, he mentioned here, rawahu Daraqutni. So then he mentioned, sahahu a'imma waqfu. So as for those who have made some editing of the book, Bulugh Al-Maram, and amongst them that have done this work that we have mentioned, Sheikh Al-Zuhairi. So he mentioned in his tahqiq, his checking of the book of Bulugh Al-Maram, where he states, when he mentioned this particular hadith, that he mentioned this hadith of Ibn Umar, where he states that his footnotes, he mentioned, as we have stated before, then he mentioned that regarding this hadith, he mentioned ضعيف جدا. So this hadith of Ibn Umar, he put as number 2, as footnote, and he mentioned ضعيف جدا, which is the ruling that he believes that this hadith is deserving. That's a very weak hadith. So the hadith he mentioned ضعيف جدا, رواه دارقطني من طريق علي ibn ضبيان and Ubaydullah ibn Umar and Nafi' and Ibn Umar marfuhan bih. So this hadith he mentioned the isnad of hadith. Then he mentioned وقال كذا رواه علي ibn ضبيان. So this narrator Ali ibn Dabyan, that he mentioned that marfu', and that he narrates the hadith marfu'an. So the narration, it has several narrations or several different parts to this hadith. One of those is the narration of Ali ibn Dabyan. So he mentioned that his narration is marfu'an, meaning it goes back to the Prophet ﷺ, as stated here in the book. Then he mentioned ووقفه يحيى ibn Qattan wal-Hushaym وغيرهما وهو الصواب. Then he mentioned that others have mentioned the hadith that is mawquf, going back to Ibn Umar, meaning mawquf, that this goes, the statement of this hadith, it goes back to the companion, the narrator here. Then he mentioned that of those who mentioned it is mawquf, Yahya ibn Qattan and also Hushaym. So then after mentioned, وهو الصواب, that this is the correct version of the hadith. So the correct version of the hadith, from what is being said here, the hadith it has two, you have the version which mentioned hadith as going back to the Prophet ﷺ, which is said to be marfu'. So of those version of the hadith, as mentioned here, that Ibn Umar, that it narrates directly upon the Prophet ﷺ, the hadith. Then there's another version of the hadith that mentions this hadith goes back to Ibn Umar, the Sahabi, not the Prophet ﷺ. So the second version of the hadith, of this narration, that is stated the hadith is actually mawquf, meaning the hadith, it goes back to the companion, not to the Prophet ﷺ. So they mentioned that that seemed that of the ulama who take this to be the more correct version, which is, it's a statement of Ibn Umar, not the statement of the Prophet ﷺ. Then they mentioned that وَقُلْتُ يعني, the one who made that the footnotes mentioned, وَمِثْلِ إعلال الدارقطني. And by this, that you'll find that others who have criticized this hadith, amongst them Daraqutni, stating that this hadith, it is mawquf and not marfu'. Then he mentioned وَعَلَّهُ الْحَاكِمْ أيضا, and also Hakim also in his book Al-Mustadrak, also he critiqued the hadith for this reason. And he mentioned وَإِبْنْ أَدِي فِي الْكَامِلِ, then he mentioned وَالْبَزَّارِ وَغَيْرُهُم. So you find that he mentioned of the ulama Daraqutni, Hakim in his book Al-Mustadrak, also Ibn Adi in his book Al-Kamil, and also Bazzar, that all of those four of those ai that they have somewhat criticized this hadith as going back to the Prophet ﷺ, and that the hadith actually goes back to Ibn Umar. So that's concerning the first of those who have commented on this hadith, which is Sheikh As-Samir in his editing. The second editing, which is of the editing of Sheikh Mahir Al-Fal, that he mentioned also when he stated this hadith as being hadith number 3, mentioned ضعيف جدا. So also he come to the same conclusion, that the hadith is very weak. Then he mentioned something which is similar, that he mentioned something just to note, just something to note and a caution, as mentioned, he mentioned ضعيف جدا, the hadith is said to be ضعيف جدا. Then he state آفاته, that the shortcomings of this hadith, Ali ibn Dabyan. So I mentioned most of the books of hadith I mentioned with a dha. This one I mentioned with dad, Dabyan. So it's something to be, as I said, no. So it shows regarding that, not either that he made an error, that in this checking, that he made an error by mentioning dad, not dha. So that, as I mentioned before, that of the benefit of having different edition of a book, different print of a book, that sometimes one can also compare between these books. Some may be more accurate and some also may make errors. So they show that there's an error that have occurred regarding concerning that in this edition or this checking. So something to take note. Then he mentioned kalam, that kind of somewhat those kalam that he mentioned here, that regarding the hadith. So then he went into a discussion regarding the hadith, or give more clarity regarding what have been mentioned by the ulama pertaining to this particular hadith of Ibn Umar. So with this, we'll go now to what is mentioned by Sheikh Abdullah Fawzan. So what is mentioned by Sheikh Abdullah Fawzan regarding what he have mentioned regarding takhrij of hadith is something similar to what have been mentioned here by Sheikh Fal in his critique. But as for the hadith that he mentioned, that the hadith in that Ad-Daraqutni, as stated by Ibn Hajar, Rawahu Ad-Daraqutni. Also the hadith can be found with Hakim in his book Al-Mustadrak. Also Ibn Adi in his book Kamil. So Kamil is not per se a book of hadith, but it contains hadith. So Kamil is a book about Rijal. So Ibn Adi, that he wrote this book about Rijal, about narrators, and that book, this book is a very important book in hadith. But also when he mentioned and critiques certain narrator, also he'll mention their hadith with it isnad. So they mentioned it also in the Ibn Adi, that he mentioned min tariq, that Ali ibn Dabyan and Ubaydullah ibn Umar and Nafi' and Ibn Umar marfu'an. So that's the narrate. So that's the hadith that is mentioned. That's the isnad of the hadith. Then they mentioned that also, that they mentioned a hadith, that this hadith also, it can be found in, I mentioned Daraqutni, Ibn Adi in his book Kamil, Al-Hakim in his book Al-Mustadrak, also Ad-Daraqutni, and also others, Al-Bayhaqi. Also Al-Bayhaqi also have narrated the hadith. So different sources that narrate the hadith, but I said the hadith, it kind of somewhat revolves around his narrator who's Ali ibn Dabyan. So Ali ibn Dabyan, that is the one, Ibn Hilal Al-Anasi or Abasi, is the one that there's some discussion regarding this particular narrator. So they mentioned it regarding this narrator, what have been said by him, by the ulama, where they mentioned huwa da'if jiddan, that this narrator with this chain going back to the Prophet ﷺ and Ibn Umar, that I mentioned this narrator, Ali ibn Dabyan, that he said to be da'if jiddan. So it's said to be, of those narrators, it's said to be a very weak narrator. Then I mentioned that Itahmahu Ibn Ma'in, that Ibn Ma'in, that can somewhat critique him severely. Nam, also Qala Bukhari, Imam Bukhari, Munkar Hadith, that is Hadith are Munkar. Nam, then I mentioned Waqala An-Nasa'i, Matruk Hadith, that Nasa'i, Imam Nasa'i, that he mentioned Matruk Hadith, that is Hadith are Matruk. That they mentioned وقال في موضع آخر ليس بثقة, that also that An-Nasa'i also mentioned about this narrator ليس بثقة, that is not one who ثقة. ولا يكتب حديثه, and is that his narrations, his hadith, they are not to be recorded. So this shows like, severe statement about this narrator from what have been mentioned. Then also Abu Zur'a mentioned wahi hadith jiddan, that his hadith are very weak. Then also it is mentioned by Abu Hatim that mentioned matruk, that is matruk. Then also Ibn Adi that state ضعيف على حديثه بين. I mentioned ضعف على حديثه بين, that the weakness in hadith, it is clear. So all of these are somewhat disparaging statement about this narrator, that all indicate that he's a very weak narrator. They're not just a weak narrator, but a very weak narrator. As stated by the ulama, but also with this hadith, also within the science of ilm and hadith, that of the things that they will look at regarding this narrator, are there those who of his others who have narrated hadith with him, so of his colleagues who have narrated hadith with him, and to see as to what have been mentioned by them regarding this hadith. So they mentioned that the hadith also that وَقَدْ تَابِعُ, that others of his others that also follow them regarding his colleagues on this hadith, that ala raf'i, ala elevating hadith to the Prophet ﷺ, they mention two narrators, Sulaiman ibn Arqam and also Sulaiman ibn Abi Dawud. So they are like three who have narrated this hadith going back to the Prophet ﷺ, that the main one is Ali ibn Dabyan, but also he has two other colleagues that have narrated hadith also going back to the Prophet ﷺ. Those two are Sulaiman ibn Arqam was Sulaiman ibn Abi Dawud. Then I mentioned that as for these two others, Sulaiman ibn Arqam or Sulaiman ibn Abi Dawud, I mentioned kilahuma ضعيف, both of whom are also weak. Both of whom are also weak. So this doesn't give any strength. The hadith of Ali ibn Dabyan, it on its own is very weak, to the extent where for it to be strengthened by others is somewhat difficult, because the weakness is very severe in this case. And also those other mutabaat, those who have of his other colleagues who have narrated with him, also they are also considered to be weak. They are also weak. So they mentioned فَلَا يَحْتَجْ بِرُوَايَتِي. So based upon this, that كما قال البيهقي وغيره. So there's also criticism on others who have narrated hadith with Ali ibn Dabyan, that were Sulaiman ibn Arqam or Sulaiman ibn Abi Dawud, that they are weak. So based upon this, that I mentioned as Sahih, that the conclusion of this hadith of Ibn Umar رضي الله عنهما قال والصحيح أنه موقوف, that the hadith it is موقوف على Ibn Umar, and of the ulama Ad-Daraqutni have said regarding that Yahya ibn Qahtan wal Hushaym and others will mention that this is the correct version of the hadith. So the correct narration of the hadith, the correct version of the hadith that have been just stated upon the Prophet ﷺ is not his statement, but actually a statement of Ibn Umar. Then it mentioned that, so they mentioned the isnad of this hadith regarding that Yahya ibn Sa'id, that they, of those who hold that narrate the hadith as going back to Ibn Umar, not to the Prophet ﷺ. And also Ibn Abi Hatim, that it is said, Sa'altu Abu Zur'a, and hadith rawahu Muhammad ibn Thabit, النافع عن ابن عمر أن النبي عليه السلام في تيمم ضربتين, that I mentioned that this question was posed to Abu Zur'a regarding the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, that of Ibn Umar, that the Prophet ﷺ, that in making tayammum, that he strike the earth twice. فقال هذا خطأ إنما هو موقوف, that is an error, and it's actually something that is mawquf, meaning it goes back to the Sahabi who's Ibn Umar in this case. So that's concerning the overall discussion regarding this particular hadith of Ibn Umar, that as Ibn Hajar rahimahullah ta'ala he mentioned, where he states regarding somewhat to where he states that that he mentioned that the hadith, as he state, Saha A'imma Waqfu, that A'imma, that they all hadith to be mawkuf, especially regarding the ulama of old. So the ulama of old mentioned the hadith that is what is proper and correct, that the hadith it is mawkuf. The hadith it is mawkuf. And as we have stated before, that of the Imma, Al-Bazzar, Daraqutni, and others, Al-Hakim, all have taken the hadith it is mawkuf, and that the hadith is not marfu. So general concerns to the hadith I mentioned about the striking the earth twice, that the hadith is ضعيف جدا, going back to the Prophet ﷺ, and the more correct version of the hadith is that it is a statement of Ibn Umar. It's a statement of Ibn Umar. And one might mention that maybe that from Ibn Umar is that he heard from the Prophet ﷺ, that's regarding concern I mentioned that of a discussion between ulama regarding that the hadith it is mawkuf, and also none have mentioned the hadith that it takes the hukum of marfu, based upon that's the ijtihad of Ibn Umar. So of some matters of fiqh related matters that we might have some of the Sahaba, they might have their may pass their own judgment on certain matters. So that hadith here it mentioned two matters regarding the discussion regarding how to perform al-wudu, that it mentioned that it is one that is two strike compared to the hadith of Ammar ibn Yasir that mentioned one, and also it mentioned that so one for the face and another strike for the hands, and also it mentioned something with that the person mentioned ila mirfaqain, up to the elbow. So the hadith of Ammar mentioned up to the wrist, but the hadith of Ibn Umar that it goes back it mentioned up to the elbow. So those are those points to be looked into or to be discussed. So as for the ruling of the hadith, that we have mentioned those ruling of the hadith, that also it is stated by Ibn Hajar, just a point, they said no benefit, that Ibn Hajar rahimahullah ta'ala, that I mentioned in his book Al-Fath al-Bari, when he discussed concerning Tayammum, that he mentioned, where he said, قال Ibn Hajar, أحاديث الواردة في صفة التيمم لم يصح منها سوى حديث أبو جهيم وأمار. So Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani, he have stated that regarding concerning ahadith, those ahadith that have been mentioned regarding description of tayammum, that there's nothing that has been authenticated except for the hadith of Abu Juhaym and Ammar. So the hadith of Ammar is the hadith that we mentioned in the last session, and as for the hadith of Abu Juhaym, it is not mentioned here. But they mention وَمَا أَدَاهُمَا, outside of these two hadith, فَالضَّعِيف, either that they are weak, or مُخْتَلِفٌ, or there's a difference في رفعي, in it being elevated to the Prophet ﷺ, وَوَقْفِ, or is a statement of Sahaba, وَالرَّاجِ عَدَمَ الرَّفْعِ, and the more correct view that they're not going back to the Prophet ﷺ. So as for what he have mentioned here, Ibn Hajar, that are the two most authentic hadith that give us a clear description of how to perform a tayammum, the hadith of Ammar ibn Yasir that we mentioned last week in the last session, or the hadith before this hadith, and also the second hadith, the hadith of Abi Juhaym. As for the hadith of Abu Juhaym, I mentioned أن hadith Abu Juhaym ibn Harith al-Ansari قال أقبل رسول الله عليه السلام نحوي Bir al-Jamal, the Prophet ﷺ, that he proceed or went towards this area of Bir al-Jamal, which is a area that he went towards. Then I mentioned that ليقضي حاجته, and his intended was to fulfill, to carry out the call of nature. Then he mentioned فَلَقِيَهُ رَجُلٌ, so a person met the Prophet ﷺ on while there, فَسَلَّمْ عَلَيْهِ, and this person gave the Prophet ﷺ salam. Then he mentioned فَلَمْ يُرَدْ, and the Prophet ﷺ did not respond to him or did not return his salam. Then it mentioned that hatta, until the Prophet ﷺ ata ala jidar, until the Prophet ﷺ he came towards a wall. Then it mentioned famasaha, then he wiped the wall, biwajhi wa yaday, then he wiped his face and his hands. So he wiped the wall, then he wiped his face and hands. Then it mentioned thumma rad alayhi as-salam, then the Prophet ﷺ he returned the person's salam. So they mentioned, so those are the two most authentic hadith as mentioned here by Ibn Hajar regarding the topic of how to perform al-wudu, how to perform at-tayammum. So the hadith of Ammar ibn Yasir, but even the hadith of Ammar ibn Yasir in different riwayat of different, that statements, but the most correct one is the one that we have mentioned in the last session. And as for the and the hadith of, they mentioned here, Abu Juhaym, that hadith is found in Bukhari, Muslim, and others. So as for that sort of discussion, inshallah ta'ala, so that's concerning the hadith that is mentioned here. Now we discuss some of the masail that raised to the fiqh that can be taken from this particular hadith. So as for this hadith, that of the masahil that are discussed regarding this particular hadith, that I mentioned adad darabat, how many times that one should strike the earth in performing tayammum. So tayammum, how many times is this to one to strike of the earth? Just so this hadith, that's not all I mentioned, that it shows a different, that's the matter that is discussed, the topic that is being discussed, how many times one should strike the earth in performing tayammum. Is once, twice, or more. So from this hadith of Ibn Umar, as we mentioned, it indicates that it is twice, that one can do so twice. So on this topic, this discussion, that there's the ulama of a khilaf between the ulama regarding how many times one should strike the earth in performing tayammum. That jumhur of the ulama, that they take the position that it is to be done once. So jumhur of the ulama take the position that in performing tayammum, that one strike the earth once. And that once is to be used for the hands and the face. To be used for the hands and the face, or for the face and the hand, as we discussed regarding the tartib. But overall, so it is to be done regarding the face and the hands to be wiped with that one strike of the hands. Then, and also with them, ليتجاوز, and also for them that the person is not allowed to go beyond his risk, kaffain. So that's the call of jumhur of the ulama. So one strike for the face and the hands, and also the person is not to go beyond his risk in performing tayammum. So that's the call of the first call of the aqwal of the ulama, and of that, of those of the ulama who have taken that view, that they have mentioned Ash-Shabi, والعطاء, يحيى ابن أبي كثير, قتادة, إكرمة, محكول, أوزائي, قول, وهو قول أحمد, إسحاق, أبو خيثمة, ابن أبي شيبة, داود الظاهري, and also that I mentioned عامة الأهل الحديث, that the bulk of Ahl al-Hadith, that they are of this view. And also they mention Ikhtiyar al-Bukhari ibn Munzir. So also those, that's the view taken by the majority of the ulama regarding on the topic of how many times one should strike the earth in performing wudu, and to also on the hands, where should one stop. So they mentioned that once with both hands for face and hands, and the person does not exceed his risk in performing tayammum, in wiping off his hands. That's qawl awwal. As for the second opinion on this matter, qawl Imam Malik wa Abu Hanifa wa qawl al-Shafi'i, and also al-Sha'bi wa al-Thawri, Sufyan al-Thawri wa Ashab al-Rahi. And it mentioned among the Sahaba who take this position, they have mentioned Ali ibn Abi Talib, Ibn Umar, wa qawl Salim ibn Abdullah, wa Hassan al-Basri min al-Tabi'in. ذهبوا, all of whom have taken a position إلى أن التيمم ضربان or ضربتان, that tayammum, it is two strikes, once for the face and a second for the hands. So for them, they take the position that tayammum, the person strike the earth or wipe the wall or wipe that thing twice. The first to be done for the face, the entire face area, and the second after the face, then he does a second strike or wipe, and that is to be done for the hands. So that's concerning that view. And also that view that they mentioned, the second strike for the hands, that a person that he wipe up until mirfaqain, goes up until his elbow, as in the hadith of, as in the statement of, as in the hadith that we discussed of Ibn Umar. So that's the view, the second view on this matter. So they take that there's two strikes, but also the person he wipe up the on his hand to his elbow. That's the second opinion. I mentioned that of those who take the position, Imam Malik, Imam Abu Hanifa, Qawl al-Shafi, الشعبي, Thawri, Ashab al-Rahi, and among the Sahaba, Ali ibn Abi Talib, Ibn Umar, وقول Salim ibn Abdullah, Hassan al-Basri, take this view. Take of this view. And Ibn Rajab mentioned that, some of the ulama even mentioned that the second view, is the view of Jumhur. Some have mentioned that this is the view of Jumhur. And of those who have taken this position, so this position, that the evidence that is used is this hadith of Ibn Umar. So the evidence that is used is the hadith of Ibn Umar stated here. And also that they have mentioned that of this view, that they use a form of qiyas, that they make a qiyas regarding that tayammum, that is a substitute for wudu. So if tayammum is a substitute for wudu, and if for wudu that you wash up until your elbow, then the same thing applies. So the same thing regarding tayammum, that a person will wipe up until his elbow. But so that's concerning that the evidence that they use to come to that conclusion. They use this hadith of Ibn Umar, but as we state, the hadith is ضعيف جدا. And second, they use al-qiyas of wudu with tayammum with al-wudu. So that's concerning that view that they're taking on this position, on this matter. And also there's like a third view, that there's also a third view. So the third view all concerning that, and that's sort of Imam al-Zuhri. So Imam al-Zuhri, that is of the opinion regarding concerning that they mentioned that, that qawl that goes back to al-Zuhri, where they mentioned that the third opinion, that they mentioned a tayammum darbatan. That tayammum, it is again 2 strikes, one for the face, and the other is for the hands up until mankibain. So to the mankibain is up to like the armpit. So the person wipe up until the armpit. So beyond the elbow, go up to the armpit. So that's a third view on this matter. That's a third view on this matter. So that's that discussion between the ulama on this particular topic. That they mentioned qawl al-Zuhri, but although I mentioned his narration, that I mentioned that he rejected this, and also and didn't, and also a position that is said by Muhammad ibn Maslama. So Muhammad ibn Maslama min al-Malikiyya, from the ulama of the Malikiyya, also of this third opinion. So those are the aqwal of the ulama on this matter regarding with tayammum, that how many strikes is the person allowed to do, more than one. That of those who mentioned that 2 can be done, and of those who mentioned can go up to 2 strikes, and they disagree regarding as to what portion of the hand that one should wipe over. So those are the aqwal of the ulama on this matter. That they have mentioned that some narration of hadith of Ammar ibn Yasir, that in the Abu Dawud, we mentioned فَمَسَى بِهَا وُجُوهُمْ, that regard that they wipe off their face, وَأَيْدِيهِمْ إِلَى مَنَاكِبْ. So some mention, some narration of the hadith, some wording of the hadith, some narration of the hadith that mentioned that they wipe their face, and also they wipe their hands up till the armpit, manakib. That I mentioned that those hadith, that some discussion regarding the hadith, that of the ulama all the hadith to be ضعيف. So Ibn Hazm and also Abu Atim or Abu Zurha, that they kind of somewhat criticize those hadiths. So those hadith, so you have those hadith relating to that particular matter. That it is mentioned here, it is stated that there's a qawl al-rabi', even that there's a 4th opinion on this matter, stated by Ash-Shawkani in his book Nail Awtar. So Shawkani in his book Nail Awtar, that he mentioned an Sa'id ibn Musayyib wa Ibn Sirin. So he mentioned that an Sa'id ibn Musayyib wa Ibn Sirin an sifat al-tayammum thalatha darabat. That sifat al-tayammum, it has 3 strikes. Then darb liwajh, 1 strike for the face. Darbatan likaffay, 1 up until the wrist. Wadarbatan li ذراعين, and also one that goes up to the elbows, up until the armpit, or up to the arms. So you have, that's the qawl that is mentioned. I mentioned, لم أقف لهذا قول على دليل. So Ash-Shawkani mentioned that as for his opinion, he himself have not per se have seen any evidence for this. He have not seen, or haven't seen any evidence regarding this opinion. But overall, that these are the views that I mentioned by the ulama on this matter. So it's not by way for the person to understand what are the opinions that are there, but they mentioned that al-qawl al-awwal, that seems to be the stronger view. That seems to be the more stronger view. And they are mentioned regarding concerning that as for those of the contemporaries who are more inclined towards the first opinion, that says one strike for both hands and face, and it goes up to the wrist, that I mentioned, the qawl of, they mentioned Sheikh bin Baz, Sheikh Ibn Uthaymeen, and also Sheikh Muqbil. So of those of contemporaries that take the position of one strike, Sheikh al-Muqbil, Sheikh Abdul Aziz bin Baz, and Sheikh Salih ibn Uthaymeen, alayhim rahmatullah ta'ala jami'an. So that's concerning what been mentioned regarding this matter. But then also that Sheikh Abdullah Fawzan, what in this matter, that he mentioned that on this matter, that is Qata, he mentioned regarding Ibn Qudama al-Hanbali. So Ibn Qudama in his book Al-Mughni, قال المسنون عند أحمد تيمم بضربة واحد. That what is like the sunnah with Ahmad ibn Hanbal, the Hanabila, so Ahmad ibn Hanbal, that with it is a sunnah for a person to strike in performing tayammum, that strike the earth once, one wipe onto the earth. That to be done a single. Then I mention فإن تيمم بضربتين جائز. But also they note, Ibn Qudama mentioned that for a person to perform tayammum and strike the earth twice, then they mention jaiz. That those who mention something which is jaz. It is something which is allowed. So they give like an allowance that one can perform two strikes of in tayammum. But they mention that, then they mention وقال القاضي يعني أبو يعلى. So of the names, so you find that each madhahib, that they have certain type of alqab, certain type of names that are given to certain of the ai So they mention amongst the Hanabila, when they use the word al-Qadi, they mean Abu Yala. So amongst the Hanabila, when they say al-Qadi, they mean Abu Yala. They mention إجزاء يحصل بضرب. That they mention وكمال بضربتين. That they mention that it is sufficient for do it once, but also for the person to do it more akmal, to do it the more complete way, then two strikes, according to Abu Yala al-Hanbali. So that they mentioned that then the qawl Sheikh Abdullah Fawzan, they mentioned والراجي, that for him also الراجي الاختصار على ضربة واحد لما تقدم, that based upon what have been mentioned before or previous, that the more correct view is that the person should only strike in tayammum once, and that for the face and for the hands up to the wrist, and that is what is the more correct opinion or position to take. So this hadith discussed concerning of, as we mentioned, that give a different version regarding sifat al-wudu, and we have mentioned aqwal of the ulama regarding as to how many strikes to be done, and also with the hands where exactly one is to wipe in performing tayammum. So that's concerning what have been mentioned regarding this particular hadith. But also that a matter just will mention here, that if absence of water and the person in the area, that there's also adam al-ma wa turab. He has no type of dirt to wipe on, and also there's no water, access to water, then what the person do in this case? As we like know, so the person is in a situation where there's no dirt for him to use for tayammum, and also there's no water for him to use to perform al-wudu. So in that case, what is to be done? So access to both those two things are, he doesn't have access to both those two means. No water, no any form of tayammum, means to perform tayammum. On this matter, that ذهب الشافعي في قول وأحمد والمزني ومالك في الرواية وسحنون يعني من المالكية وابن منذر إلى أنه يصلي على حسب حالي, that a person he prays according to his ability as he is. So the person have no access to water, cannot find water, nothing also no access for him to perform tayammum, so means to perform tayammum. So in that case the person the person in this case mentioned he prays as he is. He prays as he is. And I mentioned وَلَا عِعَادَ عَلَيْهِ, and also there is no repetition for him. He does not repeat his salat again. So the fact that a person want to perform that due to the situation that there was no access to water, no access for him to perform tayammum. So in that case, the person pray as he is. And there's no need for him again to repeat the salat later. That's the qawl, as we mentioned, of Shafi, fi qawl, Ahmed, wal-Muzani, and others, Malik fi riwayah, and others. The second opinion on this matter, قال أبو حنيفة عليه رحمة الله والثوري وأوزاهي وقول الشافعي لا يصلي حتى يقدر على أحدهما ثم صلى ثم يصلي, that a person that in that case Abu Hanifa, الثوري, أوزاهي, قول لإمام Shafi, that in this case that a person لا يصلي until he's able to have access to one of those two means, either tayammum or wudu. But the fact that he doesn't have access to perform one of those two ways of tahara, he waits until he's able, then he prays. So the person would wait until he's able to have access to those things, then he would pray, according to the second view. Then it mentioned that جاءنا مالك رواية أنه قال لا يصلي ولا يقضي, that a person, he doesn't pray ولا يقضي, and doesn't make the salat up later. لأنه adds an tahara, because he has no means to perform a tahara. Then it mentioned فَلَمْ تَجْبَ عَلَيْهِ salat. So in that case, salat is not wajib upon him. So in what is saying, or what is understood by Imam of this, Imam Malik, as I said, riwayah, that a person will have no access to perform tahara by way of water, no water is available, or have access to water, nor the person have access to means to perform tayammum. Then in that case, he mentioned that salat becomes non-compulsory upon the person. Salat is not compulsory upon the person at that state. So he doesn't pray, and there's no need for him to make up that salat later. For example, that a person in a situation where that is locked down, just as he's locked down in a place where there's no access to water, no access for him to perform tayammum. And it is time for dhuhr. In this case, according to the first opinion, that the person in that state, he will perform wudu, he will perform salat without wudu, or tayammum. He perform salah, and he doesn't need to repeat it again later. So he perform salat without any form of wudu, not without tayammum, nor without wudu, because he's unable to make those two things. But he will still pray, and his salat is valid. The second opinion, the person in that state, he would wait until he have access to perform one of those forms of tahara, until he can perform tayammum, or is able to perform al-wudu, if you have access to water. So he'll wait and not pray until then. So he delays salat until he's able to perform wudu, as they see it as tahara is a short for the validity of his salat. As for the third opinion, then that person in that state, he has no access to water, no access to performing tayammum. Then in that case, the person, it becomes that salat of dhuhr becomes, it is lifted. He doesn't perform dhuhr, and doesn't make it up later, because in that state, dhuhr becomes, is not obliged to perform a dhuhr. So that's the aqwal of the ulama on this matter. Allahu alam, they mention aqwal al-raja, that qawl al-awwal. Qawl al-raja, qawl al-awwal, that a person still performs salat even without wudu, because he's unable to have access to water or perform a tayammum. And they said the evidence of this, that they mentioned that in the case of Aisha, or the hadith of Aisha in the Sahihain, regarding Asma, the case concerning that she loaned Asma a qilada or jewelry, فهلكت, and it got lost, then the people were, and the Prophet ﷺ was find that jewelry that she lost, that necklace. So the Prophet the people to search for it, and they mentioned that فَأَدْرَكُمُ الصَّلَاةِ. So the shahid that they were looking for this jewelry, فَأَدْرَكُمُ الصَّلَاةِ. So salat became upon them. وَلَمْ يَجِدُوا الْمَاءَ, and they did not find water. فَصَلُّوا عَلَى غَيْرِ وُضُوء. So they perform as salat without wudu. فَلَمَّا أَصْبَحُوا, so when they later on, فَذَكَرُوا ذَلِكَ. So later on, they mentioned to the Prophet ﷺ, then they mentioned فَنَزَلَتْ آيَةَ التَّيَمُّمْ. Then the verse of Tayammum was revealed. And the Prophet ﷺ didn't tell them to repeat their salah. So the story that the jewelry, the necklace was lost, the people were looking for it, salat came upon them, they prayed without wudu, then after ayah, the verse of Tayammum, then it was revealed. But they did not reveal, and the Prophet ﷺ was aware of this, and didn't instruct them to renew their salah, knowing what have occurred. So they mentioned that the qawl al-awwal, that's what they use as the first opinion, that's what they use as their evidence regarding this particular case. So this concerned the masahil, or those masahil related to these hadith that we have mentioned regarding at-tayammum. So with this, inshallah ta'ala, we'll end this session. وبالله تعالى توفيق وهذه السبيل والآخرة والحمد لله. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته وبالله تعالى توفيق.